My name is Steve Jimenez, and I'm a journalist and television producer, and I'm here in Iowa City to talk about my book, which just came out a couple of weeks ago, called The Book of Matt: Hidden Truths About the Murder of Matthew Shepard. Well, I'll just say what's interesting about this particular book is that a lot of the conversation that's been generated was generated even before the book came out. People were talking about it, and there was some response just to the idea of the book, that I was attempting to really look at and examine a murder that people thought they knew everything about. And so that generated some controversy. Now that I'm actually out on tour, people want to know how I got into the story, why I thought it was important, things like that. I would say the most important thing to me is that I was drawn into this story by a very human aspect, which was really, who was Matthew Shepard, and who was a victim of a horrible, grotesquely violent murder. And so as I really began researching and I got into the story more deeply, it was really the human complexities that pulled me in. And I would say that that would be true of Matthew, but it was true of other key characters in the story. I became very close to the prosecutor that sent the two perpetrators in the case away with two double life sentences, but also the perpetrators themselves, Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson. All the early news reports characterized them in very black and white terms as kind of, sort of typical cowboy rednecks. And there are human beings there too. So when I realized their complexities, and also that they're a study in contrast. Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson are two very, very different people. And so that interested me as well. But I would say in general, the complexities of the story, the complexities of the human beings that lived it, that's really what pulled me in. Yes, quiet is very, very important to my process. I write often away from the city. One place that I write in a lot is in New Mexico, in Santa Fe, New Mexico. But I've been to the U-Cross Foundation in Wyoming 4 times over the years, which is a very remote ranch. I've written in Maine, and I do find that quiet and solitude are essential to the work I do. The other hat, that I wear when I'm a television producer, it requires really working with other people, collaborating with crews, working with an editor, and that's a whole different process. But I find for writing that I really do seek out quiet places. Well, I've gotten to the point where I can write. I can do some writing pretty much anywhere. And sometimes, because of the work I do, it requires me to write in New York City. And I can do it. I'm just saying, for me, it's not the ideal place to work. But I've learned that if I have to write in a hotel room, I can do it. And I just pull the phone cord out so that the phone can't ring. I turn my cell phone off, pay no attention to emails, and just stay focused on the task at hand. But you have to create the space you need to write wherever you can find it, because sometimes it's not going to be the most ideal circumstances. Oh boy. I won't say that it's a phrase, but sometimes, and this is one of my flaws, sometimes the voice will become a little insecure and preachy because you think the reader is somehow not going to follow the story, and you insert words or phrases that are meant to grab the reader's attention, and I try to always catch those. My editor certainly catches them all the time, but you try to pull back on editorializing and just letting the story speak for itself. So I think that that's something that I'm always catching myself at. Well, I have a background writing screenplays and also producing documentary films, and certainly in the final stages of completing this book over the last couple of years, I've really been away from screenwriting, and I do have a love for that. So I'm expecting that I will take some time to at least write a screenplay or a pilot script before going back and doing another nonfiction book, at least several months. I like the difference in form. I like the fragmented nature of film language, and it's writing in a completely different way. And you establish rhythms, dramatic rhythms, in a very different way. And I've been longing to get back to that. Well, in this case, this of course is a nonfiction book, and this is based on years of journalism and reporting that I did. So I have really an obligation to the facts and to write about the facts and to be able to support those facts with sources and credible information that backs up what I'm saying in the book. So that has been, in some ways, a very stringent discipline. When I'm working in screenwriting, unless it's something that's based on a true story, I'm really at liberty to let my imagination go and to work in a very, very different way. But again, as I said, they're very different in terms of the way you establish rhythm. So often in a screenplay, you're creating tension at the end of a scene by what you don't say and where you leave it off, and then where you pick up in the next scene. And in writing a book, it's quite different, because sometimes you really do want to finish off that scene in a way that is leading the reader to turn to the next chapter or the next page. Now, I would say that screenwriter Steve has probably influenced nonfiction journalist Steve more, simply because it's a discipline that I not only practiced for many years, but I also taught screenwriting for 10 years. But you know, as a journalist, I still have an obligation to the facts in a nonfiction book, and I keep returning to those. But I will say one of the things is, in screenwriting, you have to say things in a more concise and abbreviated way. And sometimes it's just a matter of short visual description. And so I would say that in that sense, yes, that has influenced the writing of my book. I think also in screenwriting, a sense of place has always been important to me. In fact, some of my screenplays have really been completely inspired by a place, whether it's an urban environment or a rural environment. And I would say that's something that I really have paid attention to in my writing of this book. I assumed while I was working on this book that it would stimulate a public conversation. And I would say, for the most part, a lot of the conversation up until now has been very productive and interesting. I've been at a variety of places. I've spoken at a couple of locations in New York City, in Connecticut, at the Harvard University bookstore. I was just, at Carmichael's bookstore in Louisville, Kentucky. And the conversations in all of these places have been really interesting. People have acknowledged that they initially were reacting even just about the idea of the book, but I'm finding that when people have actually read the book, that they're finding that there's a lot there that they weren't aware of, and they want to talk about those things. And so I'm excited about that, and I'm excited about the ongoing conversations that the book is generating. Well, it's interesting because on this particular story, I have a long history. And this is a story that I began working on initially as a screenplay, and I found other information about the story, and I ended up working on an investigative article for the New York Times Magazine for 2 years. And the standards of reporting at the Times Magazine are pretty strict. From there, I did a 1-hour special for ABC News 2020, and I will say there, the journalistic standards were very tough. Every single piece of paper that my partner and I generated was gone over by all of the top brass at ABC News, and by that I mean executive producers, attorneys, network executives. So we really had to make the case, and they had to review the interview transcripts, they had to review our interview notes and the record of everything we did. So in this particular story, I very much stand by the reporting I did. One of the criticisms that was floating around on the internet, actually, I think it was before the book came out or shortly after it did, was saying that I used a lot of anonymous sources, that there were pseudonyms in the book. Well, the truth is, in the book, at the end of the book, there are 112 named sources of people that I talked to for the book. The proportion of pseudonymous sources is really small. And I try to explain when the question comes up that I was dealing with a very dangerous subject, getting into the world around crystal meth and meth dealing. And anyone who knows anything about meth, or even if you've just watched the TV series Breaking Bad, you know that the underworld surrounding crystal meth is quite dangerous. And so people did cooperate with me and gave me information that helped me tell this story. And that was also on both sides of the law. It's not just that people that were involved in dealing who may not have the same credibility as law enforcement, but people in law enforcement who are still working in law enforcement today in Wyoming cooperated with me, and their safety is important to me, and the fact that they are not hurt in any way. And I can say that in the time that I've been working on this story, which is quite a long time, not a single source has been hurt by my reporting. And if it took as long as it did to write this book, and this is what it took, then this is what it took. It is, and I'd almost distinguish a little bit between spiritual and religious. I can't say that it's a specific religious tradition that informs me. I've been interested in many spiritual traditions over the years. I was educated at Georgetown, so I had a strong influence by the Jesuits, but I've been interested in Eastern philosophy for a long time, in Buddhism, and all the mystical traditions, Sufism and the Kabbalistic knowledge that's associated with Judaism. So what I would say is spirituality is important only insofar as it helps you drop down into your own center when you're working and finding what the voices are that really want to speak there. There's a quote from an old mystic, and I don't remember, I know it's probably the 1100s, 1200s, 1300s, Meister Eckhart, where he said, "Only the hand that erases can write the true thing." And I found that to be true. And if I look back, I can't look back anymore because I've shredded all the documents, but if I look back at the drafts, the multiple drafts, they would just stack up and stack up. And there was something that was a great ritual about taking those to the shredding machine. And also something scary, because you realize, oh my God, I not only spent hours, I spent days and weeks writing that and correcting it. But I think that's an important part of writing, is the paring away, the stripping down that happens. And I have found that that's a spiritual aspect of writing, is just the willingness to let the process of creation unfold and surprise you. I don't go into it thinking that I know where I'm going. I try to stay open and live in the question. Well, for me, first, a writer is a storyteller. And I know that as a storyteller, I wear different hats. Sometimes the right medium for a story is a magazine article, or it's a play, or it's a screenplay, or it's an idea for a TV series, or it's nonfiction, or it's fiction. And so, but it comes down to, for me, storytelling. So a writer to me is a storyteller. And I'm interested in writers that really have a story to tell. And sometimes, you read books where you're really wondering, you're grasping to figure out what the story really is. And sometimes that happens with movies as well. But I'm really a lover of storytelling. On a Friday afternoon in late October 2004, a little more than 6 years after the murder, I drove 200 miles to meet Kyle, a former drug cohort of Aaron McKinney, alone at an isolated truck stop off I-80 in western Wyoming. I had interviewed Kyle twice before in prison, and he had been surprisingly cooperative, so I felt more or less safe. Still, I took precautions since he had earlier advised me, "You don't know who you're dealing with," referring to his friends higher up on the drug-dealing food chain. Kyle worked in the oil fields and had just gotten off a shift. He was still in company overalls, his face and hands stained with crude. As we sat in the front seat of his parked car talking about Matthew Shepard, whom he had previously claimed to know only in passing, I suggested that Matthew might have gotten in over his head with drugs. Kyle snarled at me like I was an idiot. Yeah, and he was taking stuff away from the rest of us. Without warning, 2 other vehicles suddenly backed into spaces on both sides of us, wedging us in. When I saw what was happening, I leapt from the car and ran into the middle of the parking lot where there were more lights. Kyle shouted for me to get back in the car, but I refused. At that instant, a friend of mine, who was planted in a nearby truck, monitoring the meeting, called my cell phone. "Get out of there, Steve," he yelled. "They're setting you up." "Stay in your car. Don't let them see you," I snapped back. Trying not to panic, but worried I would get run over or shot, I spun around several times to keep Kyle's car in view as I hustled across the parking lot to a truck stop restaurant. Before I reached the entrance, Kyle's vehicle and the other two tore out of the lot, tires screeching, heading for the ramp to the interstate. Seconds later, my friend picked me up in front of the truck stop, his face a sickly shade of white. In a halting voice, he told me how close he thought he had come to losing me there. I knew he was right. With his help, I had narrowly managed to escape, but clearly I had been given a message. Driving away from the truck stop, I took my friend's advice and crouched down on the floor of his truck, out of sight. Evidently, someone more powerful than Kyle had set me up. I hardly slept that night in Laramie. Waves of anxiety surged through me till late the next morning. Why had I put myself in danger like that? The next day, still agitated, I related my roadside experience to Shepherd prosecutor Cal Raruka. He shook his head in disgust. "The methamphetamine trade has made Wyoming revert to the lawless anarchy of the Old West," he remarked pungently. "It's deadly." By then, Cal had been voted out of office in Albany County after 4 elected terms. He was now prosecuting state and federal drug cases in the Twin Cities of Rock Springs and Green River, the epicenter of methamphetamine traffic for the Rocky Mountain West. After hearing my story, Cal told me about a colleague, a Wyoming judge, who had recently been surprised by an armed male intruder in the bathroom of his home one morning while shaving. The man was there to relay a message regarding a drug case in which he was awaiting sentencing by the judge. After a few curt words, the man quietly slipped away. I saw no point in asking what the judge decided with a gun staring him in the face. But Cal's reference to the Old West brought back a conversation I'd recently had about Matthew's murder with a veteran cop in the Albany County Sheriff's Office. Friendly, with a studied good old boy charm, the cop leaned over his desk toward me, his chiseled, wind-burned face inches from mine. "You sure you're not quoting me on this?" he asked. "It's for background. I won't be using your name," I answered, trying to sound reassuring. "What happened to Matthew Shepherd wasn't a hate crime. Not at all," he confided in a low voice. "But why do you want to go digging into all that again? Why not let sleeping dogs lie?" I wasn't inclined to answer his question candidly. Instead of laying out my suspicions about the involvement of other parties beyond Aaron McKinney and Russell Henderson in events surrounding Matthew's murder, I reminded him that the killing was a seminal national event, a lot like the civil rights killings of the 1960s, as if he were somehow unfamiliar with the stigma that continued to tarnish his hometown. "The public has a right to know whether the murder was really a hate crime," I said with conviction, "and if not, what was it?" The cop stared at me as he sank back from his desk, shrugging doubtfully. Almost as an afterthought, he flashed me another knowing grin, but again his eyes told me to let sleeping dogs lie.